and bioengineered human beings. That there could come a point where God intervenes and says, this is not just a computer anymore. I have breathed my life into it.
I gotta say, this is wild, and I did not know that this is where this conversation was going.
I'm psychologist Dr. Bryan Violet, and I am elated to be sitting down with Mitch Benish today for our Sinner and a Movie this week. We'll be discussing Bladerunner 2049. This is the Catholic Sinner Show. Bladerunner 2049.
Bladerunner 2049.
I have a few preliminary statements to make. The first is excellent choice in film. Full stop. We should probably talk about the sexuality and the nudity involved for our Catholic listeners. We should probably just mention it. So for those who are out there grinding, struggling with chastity, you have to know that there are a few scenes in this film which may not be the healthiest for you to observe. There is nudity, and there is, I believe, one sex scene. I was reflecting on this and how I wanted to talk about it. And what's interesting to me is that this is a very artistic film. It is very artistic. It's a blockbuster. There's action. There's big name actors. It's a 3-hour film. It did very well at the box office, but it is ultimately an artistic film. And when you actually think about the nudity in this film, the nudity never takes place in a sexual scene. So the only sex scene, there's no nudity. But there's nudity when one of the replicants is first born and is like covered with ooze and then is like murdered and like their stomach is cut open and they bleed to death. It's not sexual. It's raw, it's vulnerable, but it's not sexual. And then there's another scene towards the end where I guess you can call her a female protagonist. A digital holographic version of her communicates with the main character. And it's really confusing about what that means for him because she's another version of a woman or a program that he fell in love with. And she's naked, but he's actually like disillusioned by that interaction. So that's not sexual. But if you have an issue with nudity and sexuality, like, please be careful and take the proper precautions, whatever it is. So I just need to say that as a disclaimer up front for our viewers and our listeners, if you're coming from a Catholic perspective. It's an amazing film. I think it's so cool. I seldom these days want to watch something more than once. I saw this relatively recently for this show, and I even want to watch it one more time. It's so good. Yeah. It's dystopian, it's dark, but it's also techie. I mean, it's beautiful. There's a lot of tech involved, which makes it fresh and new. I guess my first question for you is, do people need to watch the original Blade Runner? Like, what do they, if not, I mean, this is a cult classic, the original with Harrison Ford. What do they need to know? And does this film do service to the original, which stands alone as an amazing film and cult classic? So just bridge the gap for me from this film to the original.
I would say if you wanted to watch the original, it would neither hinder nor hamper the experience for this. Like, there's a little bit of backgrounding that the original can do for this one, but at the end of the day, like, the original, it tackles kind of a different set of ideals
of questions
than this one, while being kind of adjacent themes.
Yes, I agree. So let's just jump right into it. What do you think this movie is trying to tell us about AI? What do you think
about AI specifically?
Well, I think Denis Villeneuve is trying to tell us something about AI. I think it raises questions. Does it give us any answers?
Yeah.
I don't know that it does.
I think so. I think that it's not necessarily trying to say anything specifically about AI, because you have kind of the primary protagonist K as a replicant, which for those who haven't watched any of the films, a replicant is essentially like an android or a human
A
like
bi-
robot,
a
right?
bioengineered human is the definition.
Yep.
So they are human, but created by man.
When we're talking about like what really draws me to this, obviously, like you said, the art style is phenomenal. Like this is a fully realized world that conveys so much with every single frame, by the colors, by the design, by the shots. Everything is so artfully made. But what it really fascinates me is that normal cyberpunk, which is the genre where you have kind of this dystopian corporate infested world, falls into kind of two different worlds, right? One is the more common, where it's like the rampant production, the rampant corporatism is inherently bad, and it will ruin our lives because it turns people into cogs in the machine. The other kind of direction that it goes is um, the future is beautiful, and all of this technology will someday lead into these halcyon days where we no longer deal with any sort of lack of resources. It's kind of this utopian view of technology. Both of those are I don't really like. I enjoy watching them, but from kind of like a fantastical, like this is a fantasy setting, like, you know, this is a Dungeons and Dragons setting. But what I like about this film is that it tackles a lot of those same ideas,
Hmm.
but it does it from the standpoint of not trying to say this is wrong, this is bad, trying to say this is how it is. How do people be, like, what does it mean to be a human in this world? And that's the core of what makes Blade Runner 2049 so interesting to me.
Well, I think you can. I think that this film is a snapshot of that moment right before it branches off into one of those two directions that you mentioned. Either it becomes this utopian society or it becomes hell on earth and the end of humanity. Because it's like that moment before our worst fears become realized. When, the way people talk about AI today, where the machines finally they become smart enough that they realize that they don't need us anymore. And here's a moment in which you mentioned that the replicants in this film are treated as workers. Actually, from a replicant perspective, they are treated as slaves. And there's this building up throughout the film toward a rebellion, right? And we don't see
Hmm.
what happens in terms of the rebellion, but because they are mistreated, then there's this pushback against at least some human oppression against them. Maybe not all human oppression, but there are
Yeah.
some forms of it. And in fact, the big bad of the story has has a perspective that aligns with some of the heroes, but for the wrong reasons. He wants replicants to be able to be pregnant so that he can create more slaves. So I don't know that it makes that choice yet in this film in terms of the snapshot. It feels like it's right before Terminator. It's like right before that moment where the war
Yeah.
can come. And I think Lieutenant Joshi, his sergeant or whatever, like is in some ways
Hmm.
prophetic. Like she's villainous in a way, but she's like, she knows if this becomes public that a replicant became pregnant, a war is coming. Like to your point, I actually think she sees that there's danger coming.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting. Like you hit on kind of one of the main themes, right? Where you, I said workers, you said slaves. The reason I did say workers was because like that is the distinction people are trying to make for replicants,
Mm-hmm.
right? They say like a replicant can only live this long, and it will just work to make sure it gets its job done, and then it'll die pretty early. And that's important that it doesn't have human abilities, because then it's not a worker. Then it is a slave, because we are treating
Right.
people with their own thoughts and their own desires
Right.
as the way that they do, and
It's like
that's
it's like
like,
using a computer now. It's just a tool. There's no sentience. But in this
mhm.
film, the computer, which is embodied in a bioengineered replicant, at the very least has sentience. But the question of this film is, when does sentience become uh, a person that has a soul? And I don't think
Yeah,
the
no,
film actually answers that. I mean, you find evidence throughout the whole thing of raising the question. The Joy, for example. Like, I don't think it's really clear as to whether she was choosing to die out of love for him, or everything that she was doing was like a program to make him happy. Right? You see this in the
yeah,
character of Love when they're reviewing the tapes of Rachel and Harrison Ford's character Deckham. Is it Deckham?
Deckard.
Deckard. Yeah, and she says, "Oh, she's just mimicking love for him because it feels, if someone asks you personal questions, it makes you feel desired. Do you like your work?" She says to him right afterwards. Right? It's like she's following a program, and then they say to Deckard later on, "You didn't love her. She was engineered to make you fall in love with her. It was mathematical precision." His response was, "I know it's real. It's not math. There was something extra and special about it." But I think they play with this throughout the whole thing.
Yeah, for sure. That's what I love about it, right? The thing about Kay as the main character is, and they talk about this in their interviews about the movie, right? The importance of Kay is that he's not really that important. Like, the reason that Kay is in the situation that he's in is because he was illegally given memories by the person who was actually important. And you kind of have this entire buildup of thinking that he's kind of this android, messiah. But at the end of the day, like, he's kind of just nobody in the story
I
itself.
know. It's so
And that
interesting.
gives us yeah, it gives this really interesting view that doesn't end up being super heavy handed. And I think, you know, the question that you say about Joy, like whether she was programmed to do that or whether she did that because she actually did love Kay, like that is the question that this wrestles so well. It makes you think that it almost does a little bit of a fake out, where it makes you think it's about, the war of the replicants between the humans, but what it really is culminating to is the moment at the very end, and spoilers by the way, a moment at the very end where Kay brings Deckard, gives his life to bring Deckard to his daughter.
Mm-hmm.
And that moment is the one quintessential moment where somebody does something that feels what I think is universally considered human. And it's
Dying
done by a
for what you
replicant.
believe.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. And like in that, it's devoid of any kind of message about a broader state of the world, and it lives in kind of this brief glimpse of humanity that's built up to it. And it's just so laser targeted towards answering, like asking the question, what is the difference between a human and a replicant, and then answering it with like nothing. It's these
Maybe.
moments that people create. It's like,
Maybe it's nothing.
yeah,
Because maybe it's nothing. Because I think you can look at how Joy leads him on this path. She even says he's when he's going to take her with him and like delete the file that's in the hard drive of his apartment, and he said, if this is destroyed, you could die. And she says, like a real girl. This thought to him about to die for what you believe in, that's what makes you real, and that's what makes you human. But still, is she just saying that because that's what he needs to hear? And And then I go back and forth on the other side of things with him because he relates to her in a very human way, not in a
Mm-hmm.
robotic way. There's something
Right.
in him that wants her to be more than just a program. And
Yeah.
it's unsolved for him. And he, when he finds out that he's not special, he's working with that like underground. He's exposed to that underground militia. Freya, I think that's her name. She's the leader of it, and she says, "Oh, you thought
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
you were the special child. We all thought that." So there's something within each one of them that longs for something more than to be automation. And so
Mm-hmm.
to me, the question is, I mean, it does seem that they have achieved sentience. I mean, beyond sentience, but a soul and personhood in this film. But the question for me is, where did that happen along the way? That's unclear. Like my like the computer that like we're sure that my
Mm-hmm.
computer doesn't have a soul. But a more
Sure.
brilliant version of my computer bioengineered with flesh, we would say at some point along the way does adopt a soul. And then I start to think about the concept of miracle. I think about the concept of miracle and I think about now I could get this wrong. I could clearly be wrong about what I'm about to say in terms of the actual details and fact of it, but I'm going to try my best. From a Catholic perspective, there is space to believe in evolution. You don't have to believe in evolution, but you can, both macro and micro evolution. And there's in some forms of thought, there's a distinction between narrative creation, like in the book of Genesis, which is a story which tells us about being human, and then scientific creation, in which God guided the evolutionary process. But somewhere along the way, I think, God breathed life into a monkey, right? The spirit entered into,
Yeah.
this is the missing link. I say it very crassly,
Yeah.
but like there is something
Yeah.
that God intervenes and makes a person, a human, as something different than the natural order of things. If that is true, can we not say that this is what occurred in this film? And dare we say, may occur in the world of AI development and bioengineered human beings? That there could come a point where God intervenes and says, this is not just a computer anymore. I have breathed my life into it.
I gotta say, this is wild, and I did not know that this is where this conversation was going. But I mean, like, that is a really interesting thought process. I mean, obviously, the joke answer is if your graphics card is good enough, probably. But the the reality is like you just don't know, and there's so much. And I think this goes into kind of what fascinates me about this kind of cyberpunk aesthetic, and what fascinates me about technology is like we're reaching, we're long past a point where there's not really any kind of, you know, analog to something that would exist when uh when the Bible was written, when God or when Jesus was on earth. It's like we live in this world, even back like 1980. There's elements like the TV that kind of pop up, like the telephone, where this isn't something that existed, but it is relatively like it's just kind of an extension of the human experience that works in, like, that's not a perfect analog. But then you get to these situations where we are creating life in a facsimile of life, right? Where I have, we talked about the D&D. I'm building that by basically putting my ideas in a wiki on the computer, and I do that. And to create the artwork for it, I'll turn on Mid Journey through my Discord app, and say, I want a picture that looks like this. And Midjourney creates a picture that looks like that. And then I go into Chat GPT and start just writing out my ideas for my campaign and say, like, what are some names for this?
Yeah.
What are some more thoughts that could go into this? And building it out and basically having my artist soundboard and my text soundboard. And for all intents and purposes, I interact with them the same way that I'm interacting with another human being. There's an element of this is in some way, shape, or form a thinking entity that I'm interacting with. What when that becomes the kind of thinking entity that can turn itself on and off, when it becomes a thinking entity that exists without me giving it prompts,
When it
what does that
dreams.
mean?
What happens when it
Yeah.
dreams?
Yeah. That's a really fascinating thing that I haven't really stopped to consider much, but it is very
Yeah.
interesting to think about, like, the idea of um I don't know, evolution happening again with things that we've created.
Well, he says, I've never killed something. I've never retired something that was born before.
So
And she says,
yeah.
what's the difference? He said, I guess if you're born, you have a soul. So for them, it's actually like pretty clear cut. If you're born, you have a soul.
Mhm.
But, I mean, they call it a miracle. It doesn't make sense in terms of the natural order of things that a human basically can have sex with a replicant and life can be
Mhm.
generated. Let me ask you this question. So if we evolve further, if the tech evolves further, and
Mhm.
someone and you are faced with the question of whether or not to take on a neural link or a neural interface, you gonna do it?
Oh, yeah, 100%. I've thought about this before.
That's a
I
yes.
would
You're not worried about someone tampering with a
yeah.
chip in your brain.
No. I mean, like, yeah, but I somebody's gonna tamper with anything electronic that I have from now to eternity.
You're already being controlled and manipulated by social media.
Maybe that's where that sort of willingness comes from. Like, there is an element where if you don't operate in these areas where you have literal meetings where you're talking to somebody and you're saying, okay, we want all of these people to think this about our product. How are we going to do that? That's a real conversation that you have in advertising pretty regularly. And then you have this mass media campaign to get people to feel the way you want them to feel on a mass level. So, like, there is an element to where I have participated in it to a point where I'm like, that's just how the world works.
Hmm.
Um, the genie's out of the bottle. We can't put it back in. And I think that kind of, you can ascribe whether that's right or wrong. I'm not here to say what I'm not here to rationalize what I'm doing. But that element kind of does lend itself pretty well to being like, yeah, I'm gonna be manipulated either way. I want this AI to help me think better. I wanna
It
I would
it'll certainly give you a
augment the
competitive
hell out of
advantage,
myself.
right? I mean, the danger the
Yeah,
danger
for
is
sure.
the danger is the rich get access to it first, and their advantage competitively creates a further gap between them and the poor, right? For those who can't afford it yet, or those
Yeah.
who aren't willing to engage in that yet. But there's no doubt about it. If I could just, if I had Chat GPT in my head times, Chat GPT 10.0 in me, within me, and all information is at my fingertips, all cognitive organization is at my fingertips. I don't even have to think.
Yep.
I can I know how to relate to people because my programming tells me to. And there's still some will involved there. I mean, like, I think the skill set moving forward is not going to, people are concerned that Chat GPT is going to replace jobs, and it will, but the new skill set will be how well do you use AI? Like, that's the new skill set. How do you
Yeah.
manipulate the tech? And so, you know, why wouldn't I? I
Yeah,
often think,
and
sorry, go ahead.
I was gonna say it will. I mean, like that's the way that progress works when uh and it's unfortunate. Like I don't want to, kind of gloss over the human suffering that's going to be involved in that. There's
Sure.
obviously like elements of that cuz I work in creative fields, but at the same time like look at us with cars. Can you imagine how the carriage industry felt about that?
Sure.
Every time there's kind of this big jump in technology, people are going to get replaced, and that kind of happens, and it hurts on the short term, but in the long term, like seeing people who you only have like 10 people at a business, a small startup who doesn't have anything, right? They don't have any kind of tools, any kind of staff to be able to compete with the big companies. With chat gpt and other ai, potentially they can. You can have a group of 10 people doing the work of hundreds, and that's the promise of
Which
chat
has already
gpt. And the
happened.
dark side of that, or
Like think about farming, right?
yeah,
Like
absolutely. Yeah, the dark side of that is obviously when you have a giant corporation saying, well, we have 10,000 people, we can do that same thing with 1,000, so let's get rid of them. And
yeah.
that's the part that people really respond negatively to.
Yeah, 9,000 people are suffering now. I the thing that
Absolutely.
I think that the thing that attracts me about the futuristic genre, even in the fantasy world, the like I don't just like learning about medieval knights. Like I want wizards, you know? And but wizards have this supernatural power which transcends the natural order, so there's an attraction there, right? I think similarly, the world of futuristic IP or genres, this is that if I were to be bioengineered, I essentially get superpowers. It's like a way that superpowers are accessible to me in a way that like magic is never accessible to me. Like I can't like say a
Hmm.
spell and control the natural order, but if I could get enhanced vision, speed, strength, computing power in my brain, and like that's an actual option because the technology like alters my biology. There's something cool about that. I think there's something cool from a male perspective with that core question of competency that makes it attractive. Uh, Not to get too far afield here from the genre that we're talking. I mean, the film that we're talking about, but across the other end of the genre, the cool thing about Star Wars originally, I don't know what it is today, but originally, was that there is this tech, there is this advancement in technology, and then there were some things that were transcendent that could not be explained, and that's the Force, and that's the Jedi, and there's something mysterious and spiritual in the world of the convenience that technology allows. It's kind of like the both and, but I think especially as I get older and I get balder and fatter and dumber and like there's a natural part of me that would be attracted to some kind of neural interface that would make me think in a way that was more advanced than when I was 25 years old, or make me more athletic than I was when I was 25 years old. But I mean, I guess if everybody gets it, then it balances out again. But there, I think from a competency perspective, it's cool.
Yeah, no, I 100% agree with that. I would, if it were safe to do, I would chop off my limbs and put robot limbs on today. So I'm right there with you. I
I
think
wonder how
it's
your
like,
would your
it's
wife
this
like that?
really, what'd you say?
Would your wife be okay with that?
Sorry, I cut you off.
Would your wife be okay
No,
with that?
not a chance. Not a chance. Um, but I would. I think it's a really interesting piece of the genre itself where it does ask those questions. Like, in this one it talks about like, is something that wasn't born does something that wasn't born have the capacity for human action?
Hmm.
It gets to like, do can replicants have a soul when they're born? That's a really interesting question, but like this one is concerned with K, and it's concerned with like, can he have a human action? And like, I think that it is so important to ask yourself that question, because it says something a lot deeper than, what is the human experience. It says like, what do I do that's human? What do I do in my everyday life that really does speak to kind of the human element of my being?
Yeah.
And I think that's a really interesting question. And then when you get into kind of this idea of augmenting yourself with neural interface, um, are you still human? If you replace all of your limbs, are you still human? Like if you replace your entire body and it's just your brain, are you still human? If you download your brain into a USB and you replace literally everything and then input your personality into that thing, is it still you?
Hmm.
Um,
Or do you keep downloading your well, what about when like you keep downloading your consciousness as an attempt to be like attempt to like live eternal life on earth, and your body is like there's a lot of fictional stories, science fictional stories about downloading your consciousness so that your body is just
yeah.
a vessel and you never actually die. You die, your body dies, but then you just get uploaded into a new body and you never experience eternal life. Personally, that sounds miserable to me. This life is hard.
Yeah. Yeah. But it's still it's an interesting question that really gets to a lot of the things that philosophers have been trying to answer since the dawn of time.
Yeah.
Um,
And
yeah.
I want to say too that like, I mean, I'm just exploring. We are just exploring questions here. I'm not. I'm so far from even giving an opinion, much less a definitive answer. I mean, I'm certainly open to the Pope coming out and saying it's an evil act to get a neural interface. Like, I'm not proposing that this is the way people should think about things. I'm saying, what if? I'm raising the questions, and I want to like explore, possible angles until their end, if possible. But I think we need to start thinking about it.
Yeah. Same. Being in advertising gives me no credibility in any of this, but at the same
Yeah.
time,
Yes.
like not asking questions, it's a question that is going to be thrust on you,
Yeah.
regardless of how many blinders you put on. It is something that you one day will have to answer.
Yeah. Well, listen, this has been fun. It's been an absolute blast. I always love talking to you. You chose a great film. Is there anything you want to plug? Someday I'll have your wife on here. She'll have lots of stuff to plug. Uh, but I mean, you want to talk about your ad company and to tell companies to utilize your expertise and your giftedness to help them expand their businesses, or are you like, nah, I'm good. Play video games and have fun.
uh Nah, I mean, like, if you want to look me up, I'm the executive creative director at Red Thread. It's an advertising agency here in Lincoln, Nebraska. So if you want ads, by all means, contact us. You know, we do what I like to think is good work, and what a lot of people see as good work. Um, I know I'm being humbler than my salespeople would like me to be, but at the same time, like, you know, everybody's trying to do their best.
That's great.
But yeah, no, I absolutely love advertising and couldn't imagine being in a different industry. So call us if you want ads. Um, that's it. Did you say you're having Maria on?
At some point, I will.
It will be wild to your viewers to hear the difference in us. That's always the thing I'm fascinated on,
Oh,
because we
at
get
the
along
end.
very well.
Oh, at the end of my conversation with her, I will link back to this conversation for sure.
It's we are very, like, we're great together, and I love our relationship. We've been married for a long time, um, but we're very different people too. It's really fascinating to see people who have interacted with one of us first and then talk to the other.
I think you're really good for each other. I say that
I
as
do
a
too.
friend. I say that as a friend and as a psychologist. I think you're very good for each other. All right,
I
bud.
don't
Thanks.
disagree. Yeah, absolutely. Thank you.